Good morning. Good morning, everyone attending the side event in person. 11:30. It's 30 minutes. Okay, so thank you everyone for attending this side event. For those joining online, also welcome to the side event on human rights and environmental due diligence, putting Indigenous peoples at the center. This side event is organized by the Indigenous Navigator Consortium. The organizations particularly here today who are part of the consortium is Tebtebba, Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, and Danish Institute for Human Rights. Indigenous peoples continue to face gross human rights abuses connected to business activities within their traditional lands and territories, and these abuses are linked to various industries, including but not limited to the energy and mining sectors and agro industry. Now, the human rights and environmental due diligence that the Indigenous Navigator came out with offers a framework for businesses to identify, prevent, mitigate, and remedy such harms. For the HREDD module to be effective, Indigenous peoples must be involved as rights holders. The Indigenous Navigator supports this by enabling Indigenous peoples to collect, own, and use rights-based data, including through a new module focused on the human rights and environmental due diligence. Today we have speakers coming from the Indigenous Navigator Consortium, but also speakers from the private sector and the UN Working Group to also share their perspective on how this module will be relevant to their different mandates. Now I give the floor to our Asia Consortium member here from Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact to give us a welcome remarks. Shohel Hadjong of the Human Rights Program. Shohel?
Thank you, Robbie. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, both those of you here in person at the UN Conference Forum, our co-organizers, and also who are joining us online. Firstly, on behalf of Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, Tebtebba Foundation, and the Danish Institute for Human Rights, who are the co-organizers of this session, I would like to warmly welcome you to the session on Indigenous Navigator, Environmental and Human Rights Due Diligence with a focus on Indigenous peoples. The objectives of this session are to share a new monitoring framework developed as part of the Indigenous Navigator initiative for assessing the degree to which states and businesses are living up to their respective obligations and responsibilities. Another objective of this session is to explore how different actors can work together to ensure increased corporate respect for Indigenous people's rights and to promote the use of Indigenous-led data in environment and human rights due diligence processes. Hopefully, most of you are familiar on Indigenous Navigator, which is a framework. You know that it is a set of tools for and by Indigenous peoples to systematically monitor the level of recognition and the implementation of Indigenous peoples' rights. And it is a community-based framework for monitoring and guiding Indigenous peoples' rights and development. I hope that our speakers from co-organizers also will share more about the Indigenous Navigator initiatives. I want to say that this human rights and environmental due diligence is a valuable addition in our Indigenous Navigator framework, particularly for gathering information on due diligence practices affecting Indigenous peoples and for empowering Indigenous communities to use Indigenous-led data in environmental and human rights due diligence processes. I would also like to thank this opportunity all of our consortium partners who are involved on these Indigenous Navigator initiatives like AIPP, DIHR, Tebtebba Foundations, Forest Peoples Program, and the International Work Group on Indigenous Affairs, IPGA, as well as our all steering committee members of the Indigenous Navigator initiatives and our national and local partners in nearly 30 countries of the world, including 9 countries in Asia. And of course, our sincere thanks to the European Commission for their continued support of these important initiatives focus on community-led monitoring and data generation. We started these Indigenous Navigator initiatives in 2014, recognizing that while there are several international human rights mechanisms for indigenous peoples like UNDRIP, ILO Convention, and outcome document of World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, which ensure the rights of indigenous peoples. But there was no mechanism to monitor the implementation of this commitment on the realization of the indigenous rights. And for many years, indigenous organizations and experts have called upon state to disaggregate human rights and development data in order to uncover injustice and social exclusions. So it is encouraging that Indigenous Navigator has been generating data on indigenous peoples by prioritizing 12 human rights domains, which is outlined in UNDRIP, both at the community and national levels. So we are generating data from the indigenous community level and also the national levels, and we are trying to identify the data gap between the indigenous communities and also national index, which Indigenous Navigator is helping to do. And our community people are using this data for the advocacy, for their advocacy at the local, national, and international level. So in this phase, so importantly, we have developed 3 new modules. So one of this module is this human rights and environmental due diligence module. Another one is climate change module. Another one is biodiversity module. 3 are very important, and this human rights and environmental due diligence module is very important to this forum. And we are expecting that in the next phase, we'll utilize this module for the generating the data. And we already started the piloting of climate change module. This is collecting the information on climate change situation impacts of indigenous peoples. In the next COP30, we'll also share some results of piloting this climate change modules, which is implementing in Nepal and Bangladesh as a pilot base. Okay, lastly, however, we are honored to have with us a distinguished panel of speakers, our partners, who will share their insight, experience, and also recommendation on how business, government, and other actors can ensure that indigenous peoples are not just consulted, but respected and empowered in these human rights and environmental due diligence processes. We hope this session will contribute meaningfully to our objectives through your active participation and will support indigenous communities in collecting, owning, and using rights-based data. I will end here and hand it over to our moderator. Thank you. Thank you for listening me.
Thank you, Shoheb, for giving a warm welcome, but also giving an overview of the journey of the Indigenous Navigator initiative to where it is now. Before we delve into the new Indigenous Navigator human rights due diligence module, we'd like to give you an overview on what this Indigenous Navigator is. That is a tool by and for Indigenous peoples. So I'm giving it to Jim Rex Kalatan of the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education, Tebtebba, to provide an overview of the Indigenous Navigator.
Thank you so much, Roby, and thank you so much, Shuhel, for providing us an overview of the history of the Indigenous Navigator and its plan of expansion of different modules in addition. So before we delve into the specific introduction of the Human Rights and Environment Due Diligence module, let me just give a very brief overview of what the Indigenous Navigator is so that we will be having a same understanding on what this initiative is all about. So, as also mentioned in 2014, together with ILO, AIPP, Forest Peoples Program, FGIA, and Tebtebba, formed a partnership to work jointly towards strengthening Indigenous peoples' access to justice and development through participatory monitoring, with the vision of by documenting and reporting the situation of Indigenous peoples, they can enhance their access to justice and to development, and of course to strengthen their ability to hold states accountable. So what can the Indigenous Navigator monitor? As also mentioned earlier during the welcome, it is a set of tools for Indigenous peoples to systematically monitor the implementation of Indigenous peoples' rights as enshrined to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but also monitoring relevant core conventions, international human rights mechanisms that are relevant to Indigenous peoples, and also relevant indicators and targets of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals or the 2030 Agenda. And so why we also ask the question, why do we need to monitor, especially for indigenous communities? Well, by documenting the human rights and development situation of indigenous communities, this is a first step towards discussing with duty bearers and other external stakeholders like businesses, like corporates. And so the navigator tools can facilitate the generation of quality data on indigenous people's rights, situation, and development situation on the ground. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples doesn't have an institutionalized data collection or monitoring mechanism. And so this initiative is addressing the need for a quality data to fed into existing human rights mechanisms or monitoring at the local up to the international level. So the Indigenous Navigator have 12 thematic domains. 13th is the general human rights and fundamental freedoms. So these domains range from self-determination to cultural integrity to health, education, access to justice and remedy and such, which is you can see on the screen. The Indigenous Navigator has two questionnaire tools. We have the community questionnaire and the national questionnaire. The community questionnaire is the implementation on the ground, mainly looking at practical outcomes for Indigenous communities. So it's based on process and outcome indicators, and it assesses the state's efforts to implement these core human rights commitments through programs, budget allocations to communities, as well as the perception of Indigenous communities on their actual enjoyment of human rights. While the national questionnaire is the existing laws, regulations, and programs at the national level that uh, states have committed to implement from the national to local level. And so these both questionnaires are complementary since they measure the commitment and efforts of states and the actual results on the ground. And through this, we can see the implementation gaps between the national structure and what is the on the ground reality. Let me show you another tool of that we use in the Indigenous Navigator, which is the Indigenous Navigator Index, which visualized the implementation gaps. As you can see on the spider web, the green is the recognition in national law. It shows in the spider web that this specific country has a very high recognition of indigenous people's rights through programs, through initiatives. However, when we see the orange line, that is the community perception as a result of the community questionnaire. And so through this index, we can see that there is a gap in the implementation. Yes, there is an existing national framework, for example, on general economic and social development. But when we go to the implementation in the ground, it's very low. So through this tool, we can visualize already that there is an implementation gap between the tools from the national to the local. And last point is that the Indigenous Navigator has also its small grants program as a result for our lobby to direct access to finance for Indigenous peoples. So through the results of the Indigenous Navigator Community Questionnaire, the communities now define the needs and priorities based on their gathering. And the small grants program of the Navigator support the self-determined development that the community chose for their own good. And as mentioned earlier, just to close, we are currently implementing in over 30 countries now, starting from the pilot in 2014. So that is the, just gonna give you an overview of the Navigator before we delve into the HRED module. Back to you, Roby. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim Rex, for the comprehensive overview of what the Indigenous Navigator does. No, from data collection, Indigenous peoples doing data collection, data analysis, data reporting, and implementing their small grants through the data that's coming out from the Navigator tool. No? Now we go to the main topic of this event, looking at the human rights and environmental due diligence module that will be presented by Noah Mardiroshan of the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Sorry.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much. As Robbie said, I'll be introducing the Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence module, which is just being launched as part of the Indigenous Navigator. So if we can go to the next slide, just to give an overview, I'll be talking a little bit about why we've developed this module, the methodology, standards, structure, and then also how it can be used, most importantly, by Indigenous communities, but also how other stakeholders can use the indicators and questions. So next slide, please. So why develop this new human rights and environmental due diligence module? As we got a good introduction from Robbie, Shohel, and Mitch, the reason to develop this module is because of the extent of the human rights and environmental harm caused by business activities that Indigenous communities experience. There's a need for Indigenous-led and community-owned data that documents corporate abuses and can support Indigenous people in their advocacy, accountability, and legal empowerment efforts. There's also an opportunity here to supplement the Indigenous Navigator to monitor states more holistically in terms of more adequately monitoring whether states are meeting their obligations in the context of business activities and to fully capture the impacts of those activities on Indigenous communities, and also to reflect the emerging practice and expectation that states regulate corporate human rights due diligence, as well as the growing trend that mandatory frameworks cover both human rights and the environment. Next slide, please. So I'll give a little bit of information on the methodology, which Mitch already helpfully introduced a bit already in the context of the Indigenous Navigator more broadly, but we'll talk here about this new module. So like all tools of the Indigenous Navigator, it was developed in close cooperation with Indigenous peoples and uses the OHCHR indicator methodology. If you go to the next slide. So the OHCHR indicator methodology breaks down indicators into three types: structural indicators that measure state commitments. So this could be, for example, the existence of national mandatory due diligence legislation; process indicators that track state efforts. So looking at, for example, procedures that ensure free, prior, and informed consent; and outcome indicators that actually assess the realization of those rights in practice. So, for example, the number of incidents of business activities that have dispossessed, displaced, or relocated Indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent. Next slide, please. And so the result is online surveys. And as Mitch already introduced, we have two types of surveys under the Indigenous Navigator: the national questionnaire and the community questionnaire. The national one assessing states' legal and policy frameworks. And this is conducted through desk-based research that can be done by Indigenous organizations or Indigenous and other legal or policy experts. And then the community questionnaire, which captures the experiences that Indigenous people experience of the impacts of business activities on their rights. And this questionnaire is completed through Indigenous-led data collection processes, which might be through community meetings, focus group discussions, and other types of meetings or workshops. And this dual approach allows for a comparative analysis, as Mitch showed, where you can see implementation gaps in relation to national protections. So the key international and regional standards that this module is grounded in, it's anchored in a robust and evolving international and regional legal and normative set of standards that define the obligation of states and responsibilities of businesses to protect and respect human rights, respectively. Of course, the UN guiding principles are foundational here, as well as the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct and their accompanying due diligence guidance, which importantly extend due diligence obligations or expectations as well for environmental impacts in addition to human rights, so including climate change, biodiversity, and pollution. And then we have the international and regional instruments that provide the legal and normative grounds for Indigenous peoples to demand the protection and respect of their rights and environment, and allow them to demand a remedy when impacts occur. And so all of these instruments are what the questions of the Indigenous Navigator module link to. So you have the international law, international human rights law instruments, the regional instruments, and then at the bottom, the environmental instruments that are relevant. And so next, I'll give a bit of an overview of the structure. If we go to the next slide, yeah, so as Mitch introduced, there are 12 thematic domains that the Indigenous Navigator uses, and these are linked to the 46 articles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And here the Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence module focuses on 9 of the domains that were identified in consultations as being the most relevant to the impacts of business activities on Indigenous peoples. And here I'll just give 2 examples to give a bit more information of what's covered by the module. I'll give 2 domains. So the first one here is self-determination with the subthemes of equality and non-discrimination and consultation and free, prior, and informed consent. So among the many indicators that are covered in this domain in the national and community surveys are, for the national survey, the existence of national mandatory human rights due diligence legislation and national action plans on business and human rights. And then for the community survey, it covers the actual extent to which impact assessments are undertaken prior to the approval of business activities that affect Indigenous peoples' lands, territories, and resources. And next, another domain is lands, territories, and resources with the subthemes here. And among the many indicators that are covered under this domain in the national survey is the recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights to lands, territories, and resources in national legislation. And in the community survey, the actual incidence of dispossession, displacement, or relocation without free, prior, and informed consent, as well as capturing the extent to which redress, restitution, and compensation for dispossession, use, and exploitation of lands is adequate. And next, I'll just show a kind of screen capture here of what the online portal looks like. This is from the community survey. And as you can see, so this is what it would look like for when an Indigenous community accesses this portal online through a secure link. It gives the question on the right on the left-hand side with space to respond to the question. And then in the middle, you can see some guidance, some information about the question and why it's being asked and how to answer it. And then on the right-hand side, it links the question to the specific articles of the international and regional instruments that are being monitored by responding to the question. And so finally, I'll wrap up by sharing a little bit about how Indigenous communities and also other stakeholders can use the Navigator, and first start with how Indigenous communities can use the data that it generates. So some examples of how Indigenous communities can use the data is in their community planning processes, policy advocacy, or advocacy on a specific project, engagement with companies and private sector initiatives, dialogues with investors, engagement in international human rights fora, and when seeking remedy in terms of having evidence to present in whether it's judicial or non-judicial grievance mechanism processes to demonstrate the extent to which their rights are being respected or protected. And so Indigenous communities can use the data itself that is generated by answering the questions of the module to advocate for their rights in relation to policy advocacy or specific projects. And in addition to using the data, they can also use the questions in the questionnaire to understand what they should expect and what they have a right to claim and demand in terms of businesses operating in their territories, and help them articulate their complaints in line with international law and standards. So next, I'll just give some examples of how the framework, so not the data itself, because the data is protected, but how the framework, the indicators and questions can inspire other actors who have who need to anchor their work in the provisions of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So states can use the indicators to assess their national human rights and environmental due diligence frameworks from an Indigenous people's rights perspective. Companies can draw on the indicators to design their own human rights and environmental due diligence processes, and academics can use the indicators to conduct research evaluating whether national human rights and environmental due diligence laws and policies meet international standards. And I'll just wrap up by saying the questions themselves and the indicators can be a tool to help guide practitioners, whether they're in companies or externally, to help them know what to ask, what to look for, and they can be a source of inspiration for companies developing their own processes, developing their own impact assessments, whatever it might be, to help them know what to measure against. So I'll wrap up there and just share the QR codes for the Indigenous Navigator website and a publication that we've just developed that introduces this new module and gives more background information than I was able to give in this presentation today. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Noah. And just to let everyone know, this is the first event where this module is being launched. It has not yet been piloted. That's actually the next phase of this initiative, to pilot it in different Indigenous communities and see what data comes out and what also needs to be improved. Now, hold your questions. We'll be opening for question and answer later. We will be having a panel discussion, and I'm turning it over to Jim Rex.
Thank you so much, Roby. And may I ask for our panelists to come to sit here in front with me so that we can start the panel discussion. So for our panel discussion, we have very diverse speakers coming from different sectors. So from the Indigenous Navigator partner, we have Mr. Durga from Lahore, Nepal. We also have a speaker from the National Human Rights Institution in the Philippines. We have from the Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines, Ms. Reina Bermudez. And then we also have a representative from the private sector, from SEDEX, Mr. Walter Lin. And of course, everyone knows her, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Pichamon is also here to give us some inputs and reflection on this discussion. So to start with the panel discussion, I will directly go to one of the implementing partner of the Indigenous Navigator in Asia, which is in Nepal, to Mr. Durga Rai from Lahore, Nip, to ask you the specific question that why is there a need for an indigenous-led data collection on human rights and environmental harms, and how can indigenous peoples use this data to protect their own rights and also use the data to advocate for the recognition of rights of indigenous peoples? Durga, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim Rex. This is Durga, and I work with the large Association for Human Rights of Nepalese Indigenous Peoples, and we provide legal support to the communities, indigenous and local communities, who are harmed by the business activities and aggressive development interventions. And also, we are the part of Indigenous Navigator. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. I think that the colleagues already spoke about the Indigenous Navigator, how it works for Indigenous people and what it means for Indigenous people. So I would like to share the case, not a case, but our experience of Indigenous Navigator, because I think that would be great, right? I'm not talking about the technical aspect of this Indigenous Navigator. So what happens is as colleague mentioned, that we have two questionnaires, and the national questionnaires is actually the assessing the state commitments in relation to indigenous people's right, and community questionnaires is actually assessing the actual implementation of the policy commitment. The indigenous peoples can themselves assess their implementation of their using their own views and life experiences. This is what Indigenous Navigator works for indigenous peoples. So the most, I think one example that we use the community questionnaires in Mogar indigenous communities, and then we apply the participatory process to collect the data and generate the data, and then that data is used for advocacy at the local level, right? And also the national questionnaire is also used for national advocacy. I will talk a little bit about it. I think we have very short time, right? So the communities, Mogar indigenous community, actually they collected data as shown in the previous presentation, considering the all domains of the indigenous rights. And what happens is that after the data collection, and they did really good, the advocacy on the ground. So the local government has started mother tongue based educations in 7 primary schools. I think this is very good example. And the second thing is that also myself as a lawyer, I have supported to the local government to form a law to ensure the indigenous people's autonomy for socio-economic and cultural development. This is very nice law. And we have several examples like the Tharo indigenous community also advocated for right to self-determination. And then the local government had also brought the law that has recognized the indigenous peoples self-governance and judicial institutions of indigenous peoples. And again, the Mal indigenous community, their spiritual lands have been recognized by the law. I think these are a really good example from the community level. Those data has been used by the indigenous community. And then at the national level, the indigenous peoples of Nepal actually organized a series of meetings and consultations that we have developed national indigenous development plan, and that plan has to be submitted to the government and national planning commission. And some of them, I'm not saying it all, but very important indigenous demand to development that has been included in the indigenous development plan has been reflected in the national development plan, right? I think this is some very good example when it comes to indigenous navigator. I'm not claiming that we get all the rights, but it is of course very good example. And then I would say it is not just a technical exercise to collect data, right? It's most important is that how we can mobilize the indigenous peoples to ensure their self-determined development as envisioned by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Okay, when it comes to this due diligence module, I think it's really important. We are not really exercising it, so we are really interested to do it. But I think, the development interventions and business activities, they are really impacting to the indigenous communities. That such activities are impacting their lands, territories, and resources, sometimes even causing ecocide and genocide against indigenous peoples. This is what really alarming, serious situation. So I think that this model also going to assess the indigenous perspectives of human right due diligence and the legal things and other things, what exactly the government is doing when it comes to business and human rights. And I think that may be going to be very interesting, right? So I think, yeah. So this is really important for indigenous peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Durga, for really highlighting how the data and results from the Indigenous Navigator were able to influence policies, laws, and spaces from local to international level. And also adding the potential role and impact of this new module to monitor state obligations and also corporate responsibilities. So from an Indigenous Navigator implementing partner, we would like to go on to a national human rights institution. We have here Attorney Reina from the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines um, to, to, uh, to ask the question on how can national human rights institutions use their mandates to ensure that businesses, corporates respect Indigenous people's rights through inclusive human rights and environment due diligence processes developed in consultation with Indigenous communities. Reina, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much and good afternoon everyone. Magandang tanghali po sa lahat. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. We thank the organizers for inviting the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines to today's highly important session on IP rights in the context of businesses. So I want to start this short intervention on laying down the mandates of NHRIs and also the premise that while businesses are private and that they are not part of the state, their growing influence, which is sometimes bigger than states, cannot be used as an excuse so that they will not be responsible in the protection and the respect of human rights. Not just because it's what some legal framework provides, but also because it is the moral thing to do. On the part of NHRIs, we work within the mandates of human rights protection, human rights promotion, and policy recommendation on human rights issues. And pursuant to our mandate on promotion and policy advocacy, we can engage with businesses to assist them in learning more about human rights, as well as mainstreaming the UN guiding, the UNGP in providing that companies should have a policy commitment in respecting human rights. However, when it comes to the protection side, this is where it becomes challenging for NHRIs as we cannot go beyond the mandates that are provided to us. In the case of IP rights protection, it would be helpful for NHRIs to take a look at the existing legal instruments that can be used as basis in engaging with businesses. For example, the Philippine Constitution and the IP Rights Act in the Philippines provide legal frameworks for the Commission on Human Rights to take cognizance of IP rights as IP rights issues as human rights issues, which would allow the CHRP to create programs, projects, and activities addressing IP issues. It's also worth noting that the Constitution of the Philippines provide CHRP the mandate to investigate all human rights violations in relation to civil and political rights. Businesses may still be subject to investigation if they abuse civil and political rights of IPs. However, when it comes to economic, social, and cultural rights, investigative monitoring may be pursued. While this may seem limited, we also recognize and acknowledge that that human rights are evolving, and that the interrelatedness and interdependence of human rights may allow the investigation of economic, social, and cultural rights-related abuses in the context of CPR. Also, the NHRIs can exercise monitoring functions for both state and non-state actors, so that would include corporations and businesses. And it can also conduct inquiries and fact-finding missions. Like for example, in 2017, the CHRP concluded its national inquiry on IPs, and in 2020, the National Inquiry on Climate Change, both of which provided recommendations on state obligation to protect and promote IP rights and on business responsibility to respect them, which would include respecting free, prior, and informed consent, upholding ancestral domains, protecting indigenous systems, knowledge, and practices. Businesses must also be mindful of their impacts on the environment, considering that this would affect the food source, livelihood, and traditions and cultures of IPs. NHRIs also advises the government on human rights-based approaches in crafting rules and regulations that affect business enterprises. And this is one of the opportunities wherein we can directly work with the government in ensuring that businesses still respect human rights in the conduct of their operations. Excuse me. Part of this is ensuring IP representation and participation in legislative and decision-making processes. And this will ensure as well that there's respect, the protection, and fulfillment of human rights, including IP rights, being at the center of policymaking. But at the heart of all of these are the voices of IPs, whose rights must be protected and upheld by the state. The state remains to have that duty to ensure the protection of human rights. And NHRIs have that mandate to conduct the consultations and facilitating dialogues between populations such as indigenous communities and the state and non-state actors. We can also create opportunities for IPs to advocate for their causes domestically and internationally, and CSO initiatives such as advocating for HREDD processes, which are developed in consultation with IPs themselves, can also help NHRIs in exercising further its mandate to protect human rights by providing evidence-based data for policy recommendation. Human rights must be at the center of any intervention that affects communities, and NHRIs exist precisely for that. And it is with our hope that NHRIs would continue being that platform where people's voices are amplified and their causes advocated for. And with that, thank you very much and maraming salamat po.
Thank you so much, Attorney Reina from the CHRP, for giving us information on the role of NHRIs in relation to corporate and business responsibilities, and also in showing the initiatives of your commission in pushing for the respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights, which is the three obligations of states as enshrined in the UN DIHR. So before I go to the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, I would like first to ask our private sector representative here from SEDEX, Walter, how do you think companies or corporates could draw on initiatives, monitoring initiatives like the Indigenous Navigator in their human rights and environmental due diligence process to have an enhancement and relationship between and meaningful engagement of corporates with Indigenous peoples and communities? Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Walter from SEDEX. So SEDEX is a private sector membership business organization. We have 90,000 members globally, including very big international brand retailer, but also a lot of SME in different countries. Our role to support our member is literally focused on the HRDD, but also the environmental compliance. And I think before I to answer your question, I definitely see the tool we have mentioned today is a really good like enhancement and add-on to the corporate's HRDD process. But I would like to raise two challenges before I to answer the question. If you look at about the private sectors, if very big companies, I think the first challenge is they are finding it very difficult to reach out to the upper tier supply chain. I know the community is normally sitting at a very how to up the supply chain, and there are so many tiers supplier amount to the buyers and retailers. So that's something they find it very struggle. So normally they can engage with supplier who have tier one, tier two, which they have direct brands. But when you say reaching to upper tier supply chain, even to the community level, it's a practical challenge for the private sector, to be honest. And second one is about the mindset. I think a lot of corporates, international brand, globally, I think how much they really recognize the community rights. And because they know the community rights, see some media, see some story, which is very easy to accessible by day-to-day social media. But the question is how much, as like a senior person or the board level, really to see the community rights are relevant to the business. Especially we're talking about in the landscape of supply chain. I mean, for your own operation, yes, you are operation Indonesia, Philippines, you've got your own sites, you're affect for the local community. But if you're talking about your suppliers, sometimes you don't know where they are. And if your supplier doing something harm to community, even the brand or retailer, they have no idea. But also, as mentioned about from the supply chain perspective, I think the biggest challenge for brand and retailer for HRDD is about they also find it very struggle because they can engage with tier one, tier two, but anything then further tier, even they have no visibility. And then we talk about the top one, which is the community. They found it very difficult. So I think I raised the two challenges to share with everyone. And I think to answer your question, I do think the tool we have produced today is definitely with add-on for the HRDD process. So the role we play is about we do provide a questionnaire and also like on-site audit methodology to support member on the HRDD process. But we can only reach out to manufacturing levels, farm level. But if anything further than that, we find it very struggle. So I think our current ethic chef assembly questionnaire or our methodology, I think really could be a very good marriage or a pairs with the tour. And I think this is also, I do think it's very important to support. But I think when I come to a more practical situation is about if we implement this tool by the business, I think there are a few things we need to do first. Tool is good, but we need to look at about how efficiency, effectiveness they can bring in. So first thing, I think not only from us, I think we need to work as like a ecosystem to really to raise awareness raising for the private sector companies because their mindset on community is very low. And even I can say zero for some country and for some sectors. But also things like the ban, if we had a tour and then I can persuade our members like international brand to use the tour, but we need to think about they can adopt this tour for their own operation. But when they come to the supply chain, you got an intermediary, you got agency, you got tier 2, tier 3, and how can you to bring this tool really can you can have the tool, right? You can say, oh, you need to use that. But by the end of the day, the person who are directly dealing with the community, they might really buying for that and no one coaching for that. So I think there is a very important exercises we need to bring every tier of the player to using the tool. So I think today is a very good start point to have this tool, but I'm more important, I'm concerned, or I think this is something more we can do is about how can we scale up. I think this is the more important. So I will pause for now, but to summarize, I think it's very important. It's a very good tool to enhance current corporate HRDD tool, but implement level I think it's a challenge. I think this is something we need to have a further discussion later on. Thank you. Sorry.
Yes. Thank you so much, Walter, for giving also the background in corporate supply chain and also the potential impact of this tool to implementation and also the challenges we may have encountered in piloting these module, especially in for corporates and businesses to really use this on the ground. So I will go to the UN Working Group now for Business and Human Rights, Dr. Pitsuman Yopantong, to ask also on the mandate of the UN Working Group and also to ask how can community-led initiatives like these Indigenous Navigator, a IPP-led initiative in monitoring corporate human rights abuses against communities, and also what can be the potential role. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming us here in this session, and also just to addition, how can be this monitoring tool support the mandate of the working group in especially in monitoring and reporting? Which one you have the floor?
Thank you very much, and thank you, colleagues, for scooching in. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see so many people in the room as well. I mean, this is exciting, right? It's exciting because, and it's not just because I'm sleep deprived, but it's exciting because since Sunday, I have been in 20 sessions, events, meetings. And in every meeting, event, session, I think that makes sense, I have been hearing about so many problems involving business-related human rights abuses. I mean, it's been relentless. We hear about land grabbing, we hear about water grabbing, we hear about land dispossession, we hear about judicial harassment, and the list goes on and on and on. And that's the reality we live in. And as I said in my own opening remarks, this reality is probably going to worsen given how the geopolitics that we see happening right now is heading in a direction that is not really rights respecting. But where am I going with this? This gives me hope. This is actually part of a solution. We're here not talking just about yet another set of problems, and we know there are many problems when it comes to business abuse of Indigenous peoples' rights. But this is a proactive solution and one that is owned and developed by Indigenous peoples themselves. Now that is exciting, and that's something that I, for one, can definitely get behind. And I know my colleagues on the working group will most definitely feel the same way. I mean, in relation to how this can help our work when we're, speaking with governments, when we're speaking with businesses, when we're doing our own work as well. And colleagues, some of you may already know that the working group is currently developing a concept note on free, prior, and informed consent. So information derived from this tool can very much be used to help inform that information note that we're looking at hopefully delivering to the Human Rights Council next year. But it's also when businesses come and say to us, look, okay, I'm not going to do the business voice. Sorry, I don't think businesses sound that way. I'm just saying, if there are those in the room, I'm just trying to, okay, I'll try and do a different business voice. So when businesses come to us and say, look, we have tried, it's very difficult to understand. Sorry, your laughter is throwing me off a little bit. We have tried. It's very difficult for us to understand our value chains, or really they'll say supply chains, and to go beyond tier one. But it's also Indigenous peoples are hard to engage with. It's like we don't often know what they want, and there are so many different communities. Who do we ask to actually understand what's needed? Who do we listen to? What are the facts on the ground? And of course, you add to that, the fact that there can be fragmentation within communities, especially, we see this with mining projects, right? A divide and conquer type of strategy that businesses can put in place can impact the social fabric of cohesion in these communities. So that makes it all the more difficult for businesses to conduct human rights due diligence. But at the same time, one has to be cognizant that businesses themselves are part of the challenge here, right? They are also making it that much harder to conduct human rights due diligence because of the impacts that they can have on different parts of an Indigenous community when they go in for a project and so forth. But so where I'm going with this is to say that when businesses come to us to say, all right, tell us, what do Indigenous peoples want? What are the issues? Show us with evidence, with empirical evidence, which is the other thing we often get asked. Now we can show them something, right? This tool, I think, and I was looking through it again just now, it's empirical, it's qualitative, but it's empirical. To have a methodology that's being developed by Indigenous peoples themselves is extremely valuable because that is something that is very missing still. And the broader, even I would say, scholarship on human rights due diligence, but also in relation to Indigenous peoples' rights also. So to see this, it is a very valuable, empirically driven tool that I think for businesses, they should definitely be consulting, but also for governments too. I mean, ultimately, governments are the duty bearers in all of this, and they should also really be the ones funding this, well, the EU should continue funding this, but it's also governments from this region, right? The ones who are from other regions, they should be funding this because this is their way of data gathering, but in a way that's respectful, that prevents reprisals, but also ensures that the experiences, the cultures, the livelihoods of Indigenous peoples are represented by themselves, not by someone else. So that is valuable. As I said before, about 10 times already, I think, because we need more of these types of initiatives. For the working group and a lot, please tell me when I need to stop, by the way, because I can keep on going and going.
You have 30 seconds, Jawan.
All right. This then will be my final point, which is that I think in all of the remarks I've delivered, especially in gatherings with Indigenous peoples, colleagues in the room, I've always said, we as I'm not an Indigenous person, but I have always said to others that we don't have to be an Indigenous person to stand up for Indigenous rights. But I've also said that, we need Indigenous peoples to be active rights holders. We need to provide them with the space, with the ability to air their grievances, to say what they need to say, to share their experiences in a way that does not result in retaliation or reprisals. And I think this is an example of that. It's an example where Indigenous peoples themselves are taking an active role as rights holders, but showing how, in doing so, you can be constructive, you can contribute in a way that is intellectually driven, but also really normatively grounded in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and UN DRIP, but also in other international human rights standards. So that is more than 30 seconds, I'm sure, but it's all to say, if you need a single takeaway from me, this is a great initiative and the working group completely supports it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pitchamon, and for your input, especially on the highlighting that Indigenous peoples are not merely beneficiaries of frameworks and tools that are created by external factors, but they can actually co-create solutions and create solutions, especially initiatives and monitoring and reporting of implementation of the rights. So the reason why I gave her 30 seconds is that because we can open the floor to the audience for questions, for reflections, and not limited to the questions and answers to the current panel, but also to the previous presentation earlier on the new module. So we can have time for that. So can I see a raise of hands? Okay. So we can take 2, 4, 5 questions at once. 6. Okay. Please be brief with your question, your reflection, so that we can have more time for the response. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. My question to all of you, that what is the role of community? We are talking about the indigenous community and under the pre-prior information consent. So why it's not implemented by the either by corporates or by government? I'm from India. Our constitution for indigenous community. There is a special provision in our constitution, and this FPIC is only at the consultative and consultation. So what is the difference between consultative and consultation? If community say, no, we are not want to the this type of project because it's impact our inherent rights. So what about this, and how community, the approach for the grievances? Because we have a National Human Rights Commission, province level commission, even for indigenous community, there is a special national level protection right committee for indigenous community. They are all, approach, file the petition, but and the last, they either by government authority or by corporates, it's not listening properly. And if they are raising that voice, then they put human right defender as a anti-social element or anti-national. So what can we do? Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. I'll go first to Indonesia and get back to you. Okay.
Thank you, Jim Rex. I will give quick questions for the first panelist. How we indigenous peoples in Indonesia can involve with Indigenous Navigator, and then the second for our National Commissioner of Human Rights from Filipina and also our brother from SEDEC. Why the company always divided the community? Why you carry out the activity? Thank you.
Thank you. You can go here.
Two operational questions, and I'm not sure if these questions might be to the supervising or coordinating group of the module. So, number one, I share the excitement about this, and I can imagine communities who would be willing and ready to contribute data and information. They might be so excited that they might disregard the security risks that they face. So I'm interested, how do we balance that? We know that a lot of communities want to contribute data and information here and use the tool, even to the point of disregarding the credible and potential security risk they face. So how do we balance that? Second, how do we treat, pardon my limited understanding about it, but how, if indigenous communities would have open access, and every indigenous community will be able to provide data here, how do we vet communities who we know were part of the divided part? So like we know historically the community was divided, and one section of them um, made some questionable decision, questioning the legitimacy. For the sake of simplicity, what if an illegitimate indigenous community attempts to use the platform to input questionable data that might be in direct conflict with a prior data that was already given. So I'm interested to, maybe just to operational terms, but very excited about this.
Thank you so much. For the interest of time, I'm very sorry. I will take last one question from me. Yeah. But no worries. Our speakers are here after the event for everyone to approach. Please go ahead. Please turn on your microphone. Okay.
Just wanted to add to Shruti's question about whether or not you've identified an implementing partner for Indonesia yet. And then a really easy question, what languages is the Indigenous Navigator available in?
All right. Thank you so much for all of those questions. So I'll be going back to our speakers for this panel and also from the first set of speakers earlier. And we have a lot of questions regarding FPIC, on the grievance mechanism, how can communities implement this module, and security risk, and also specific on private sector, and also on the uploading data, especially on the availability of data in the portal and the vetting process. So every speaker can have a minute to respond and also have your closing reflection. I'll start with Durga.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think that other colleagues that they have presented, maybe they are the best person to answer some of the questions that you raised. Okay. And brother, what the question you have asked is also we have the same question that we're asking. Okay. Why? Yeah. Yeah, same boat. So we have to find the answer actually, right? We are fighting for ethic, we're fighting for human right due diligence, and maybe I can talk about the security issues, but only I can talk from a context, right? In Nepal, at least, we are not facing such kind of intimidation and threat when it comes to collecting data, at least, right? Thank you very much. Maybe I should stop. I need to give other colleagues to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Durga. I'll be moving on to our National Human Rights Institution.
So yeah, so what can NHRIs do, particularly in upholding FPIC? Well, at least in the context of the Philippines, it's a requirement. Projects cannot go if there's no FPIC. But we have seen many instances wherein, as what so you're saying, the division. So there are situations wherein the businesses themselves would facilitate having that divisive um, activities within the community so that they can get the consent from one sector but not for the whole community. So what an NHRI can do about that is, one, we can help in shedding light on these kinds of situation. While we see that, of course, we are not in that position to conduct the mediation between the communities. However, we have the mandate to conduct inquiries, for us to also do consultations in other parts of the communities, so that we can all have that holistic appreciation of consent, which, when we see that there is no genuine and rooted consent coming from the community, then that's the time that we can raise the concern with particularly the authorities, such as the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, though I would say there are still so many things that can be done there, but I will not will not go into that. So yeah, so there are those opportunities, and even within the state, there have been progress, and we see these little pockets of more inclusive processes that the CHR and maybe NHRIs with their respective countries can have a voice on. And our role really is facilitative. We're not the ones who are speaking. It's us amplifying the voices of the community. So in cases where there are issues as regards FPIC, then that's also our role to take a look. Is this really genuine? Is this really true? And from there, then we can have our recommendations, which can hopefully influence how the government would now treat these FPICs coming from divided communities. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm also giving you a final moment to reflect.
So thank you for my sister from Indonesia asking why the private sector not really engaged with the community. I guess if I can take the analogy, it seems like a little bit like a Pandora box. And they don't know. I do think I think there are several levels. One is about the company, they get that, but they see it's a Pandora box. They open, they don't know what to do. Is there any like penalty, any more troubles for them? But the other level is about they have no idea. So I guess the action or the solution to change is more about, it's not always asking the private sector to come. I think we need to, as a UN, as a working group, we need to provide a platform, which means the community can be more proactive to talk to the sectors or like chambers, commerce, industrial organization to have an open conversation to ensure people feel relaxed if they open like Pandora box, because there is no weapons, no any something surprising, then people can be willing to do that. But also I think the language, how you communication, use the language which the corporate can understood. I think this is also very soft skill. I think we need to think about how to repackaging what you want to say and making something nicely appealing for the corporate to understood. Because this is also the similar problem for as brands when they talk to the supplier. They always talk about ESG, HRDD, but supplier, SME, they have no idea. So how can you repackaging, you put some makeup, right? So people make feeling, see, understood, make you nice, then they can approach into you. Again, I mean, just an example to share my points. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walter, for that final reflection. I will give please give us more time to extend just to respond for these questions. I'll be giving to Pichaman for her final reflection.
Basically, please give me 10 more minutes because I love Walter's points. The makeup, as someone who can't put makeup on myself, I'm curious to see how we can put makeup on HRDD. But I also like the Pandora's box reference because, you know, at the end of all of the, you know, stuff that comes out of Pandora's box, it's hope, right? At the end. So this is what businesses need to bear in mind as well. Yes, it's going to be hard to confront all of the problems that your business might unravel by asking a community, what are we doing wrong or what are our suppliers doing wrong? But there is hope at the end because the guiding principles aren't meant to be really punitive in a way. It's meant to encourage learning. It's meant to encourage transformative behaviors. It's about exercising leverage, about getting businesses to do better, to renew that social contract. But that being said, I'm going to try and answer the questions despite that the two of you asked, despite not being people involved in the development of this tool. So what I say may be completely inaccurate, but let's see. So I think in terms of the languages, from my understanding, it's 3 languages, right? English, French, and Spanish. Because of the countries that this navigator is implemented in. And then in relation to the methodology question, now that's interesting, right? Because from my perspective, HRDD is a lot about FPIC, but it's also not just about FPIC. So in a way, it's about capturing what communities are experiencing in relation to land dispossession, in relation to forced evictions, in relation to water contamination. So that is not just about FPIC. And I think that's what the navigator manages to capture as well, which is very valuable for the human rights due diligence process. Because yes, there will be mixed messaging. There might be mixed experiences, but I understand probably the team that goes and collects the information will have some sort of methodological safeguards in place to address those concerns. But from a kind of theoretical standpoint, it could be an issue, but at the same time, even if there are some anomalies that get submitted, that should be detected. If you look at the kind of the statistical, I'm not using the words right, but if you look at the common pattern, right, across those different types of abuses that get reported by these communities. But ultimately, I'm just going to end here and say that, look, for me, this is all about preventing not just business-related human rights abuses, it's also about preventing epistemic exploitation. Speaking here as an academic, I know even for academics, we can be very exploitative when we go out and ask information from Indigenous communities and then never report back. This is a way to add transparency to that process as well. So it's about encouraging better outcomes, but equally better processes when it comes to ensuring human rights due diligence, but also ensuring upholding Indigenous rights. So with that, handing back to you, Jim Rex. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Pitchamon. And I will be giving a few minutes to Noah to respond on some of the questions that are maybe related to the tools before we close the session. Noah, please.
Thank you. Just to add on, thank you so much to the chair of the working group for chiming in. Yeah, very helpful. But just to say, in terms of anyone who wants to use the module, who wants to conduct the questionnaires, the online portal on the Navigator website allows you to create an account. So it has to be approved, and there's a process for that. But if you have any questions about setting up an account and using the module, there's 2 email addresses, contact information on the flyers that you have on your tables. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. And also to say regarding potential security risks when it comes to the data itself, the data is secured. It's meant to be developed by and for Indigenous communities, and it won't be made publicly available without the free, prior, and informed consent of the producers of the data. So it's only used by Indigenous peoples when they want to use it in the way that they want to use it. And in terms of the languages available, and you are correct that it's in English, Spanish, and French, but it's also in response to demand. So please, if there is a use case to have it translated, we want to know about that so that we can make it available. And it is also tailored to the local context by the users of the questionnaires. So I'll see if Robbie has anything to add to close out. If not,
Yeah.
well,
So thank you so much for the responses. I'll give 1 minute to Robbie to give a final reflection and also to close this session.
So thank you everyone for joining, but just on the, how do you call it, the security risks. No, so the way that the Indigenous Navigator portal is designed now, not everybody can enter data. So you have to register, and it has to be vetted by the consortium members. And at the moment, the consortium members are Tebtebba, AIPP, FPP, IFGIA, and DIHR. Now, if it relates to the Philippines, it's Tebtebba who's looking at that. If it relates to other countries in Asia, it's AIPP. Now, when you register and enter data, again, it does not go out in the public directly. There's a validation process and vetting process that's undertaken, again, by the consortium members. And there's also a process to get in touch with other organizations working with those communities where the data is coming from to validate if this information coming in is correct or not. But academics, non-Indigenous organizations, and also governments cannot use the portal. You can use the tool as reference, but you cannot enter data into the portal because that's for Indigenous peoples. So that's my addition. Thank you so much. If you have other questions, the team is here to respond.